Welcome to my channel. Before we dive into this astonishing true story, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe because we've spent countless hours uncovering verified historical records to bring you this story. This isn't just a tale of escape. It's about a man who became a legend during the Civil War, striking fear into slave hunters and Confederate forces alike as the deadly Ghost Sniper. He was born into a world that was designed to break him, a small cabin somewhere deep in the American South, where the sun beat down relentlessly on cotton fields, and the chains of slavery weighed heavily on every family. From the very first day, his life was defined by fear, control, and the constant presence of violence. His parents had taught him the ways of survival from the moment he could walk, how to move quietly in the fields to avoid punishment, how to avoid drawing the attention of the overseer, and how to hide when the whip came too close. Even as a boy, he had an instinct for observation. Every sound mattered: the creak of a floorboard, the distant barking of dogs, the snap of a twig in the woods. Every shadow could be deadly, and he learned early that staying invisible was often the only path to survival. But he was more than cautious, he was clever. While most children his age were merely trying to endure the long days of labor, he began noticing patterns in the movements of the slave patrols. He watched them as they walked the fields, noting which guards were quick to anger, which dogs were skittish, and where the overseer preferred to sit and watch. He memorized the layout of the plantation, every tree that could hide a body, every fence that could be climbed, every creek that could mask his footprints. The adults noticed it too, though they never said it aloud. There was something in his eyes, a quiet intelligence that promised he would survive when others might not. When he was old enough to work alongside the men in the fields, he began to secretly practice skills that would later define him. Using makeshift slingshots, he learned precision and timing. He experimented with small knives and found he had an uncanny ability to handle them without hesitation. More importantly, he studied human behavior. He noticed how slave hunters reacted to certain sounds, how panic could spread faster than bullets, and how a single well-placed distraction could allow someone to disappear entirely. Even in a life designed to crush him, he was building the foundation for a talent no one could ignore, one that would eventually terrify his pursuers. There was also the subtle education passed down from older slaves, the elders who whispered cautionary tales under the cover of night. They spoke of escapees who vanished into the forests, of hunters who never returned home, of paths through the swamp that led to freedom. These stories were both warnings and lessons. He absorbed them all, internalizing not just the geography of the land, but the mindset of survival. He learned that fear could be weaponized, that patience could be as lethal as a rifle, and that sometimes the most powerful tool was simply knowing when to disappear completely. By the time the Civil War erupted, he was no longer just a boy trying to survive. He was a young man with unmatched instincts for stealth and observation. He had grown strong in the fields, agile in the forests, and disciplined in ways that could only come from a lifetime of constant threat. The very oppression designed to make him weak had, paradoxically, made him into something far more dangerous: a shadow, a ghost in the eyes of anyone who tried to hunt him. Those who would later call him the Ghost Sniper were unknowingly walking into the path of a man whose every move had been honed for survival and who had learned that his greatest weapon was not firepower alone, but cunning, patience, and the ability to vanish when others thought he was cornered. The early life he endured under slavery wasn't just formative, it was transformative. It gave him not only the skills, but the mindset that would allow him to outwit entire groups of hunters, to strike with precision, and to leave behind the legend that still chills the imagination today. In a world designed to suppress his humanity, he had cultivated a lethal intelligence, one that history would later remember not just as survival, but as mastery of the art of the ghostly hunt. As he grew older, the boy's survival instincts evolved into something far more precise, a skill set that would ultimately make him one of the deadliest marksmen of the Civil War era. Unlike many others, he did not rely solely on brute strength or speed. He relied on observation, patience, and a meticulous understanding of how to use his environment to his advantage. Even before he touched a real firearm, he practiced precision and timing with whatever he could find: small stones, sticks, and rudimentary slingshots. Every throw, every aim, every calculation taught him about angles, distance, and the way a moving target could be predicted. These exercises may have seemed like games to the other children, but to him, they were lessons in survival, each failure and success sharpening his instincts. When he first held a gun, likely one confiscated or lent by sympathetic individuals, the boy discovered that his natural skill for observation translated perfectly to marksmanship. He learned quickly how to steady his breathing, how to align his eyes with a moving target, and how to account for wind, light, and terrain. Unlike most young shooters, he instinctively understood patience. He could lie in the underbrush for hours, completely still, waiting for the perfect moment to act. Every movement he made was deliberate. Every shot was calculated to maximize impact while minimizing risk. This patience became a defining feature of his later hunts. He was never rash, never careless, and never easy to predict. He also studied the hunters themselves. He watched how they moved in groups, how they relied on dogs and loud calls to flush out runaways, and how fear could make them sloppy. He began to see patterns in their strategies, noticing how certain paths were used repeatedly, how traps were set, and how overconfidence could blind them to danger. Over time, he learned how to manipulate these behaviors to his advantage. A broken branch here, a misleading footprint there, and suddenly a well-trained team of hunters could be lured into a false trail, giving him the upper hand. He understood that marksmanship was as much about psychology as it was about aim. The ability to control the environment and anticipate human reaction was what made him truly dangerous. His skills were not developed in isolation. Older slaves, recognizing his talent, occasionally guided him, sharing wisdom about concealment, the natural terrain, and the movement of wildlife. They taught him to use shadows, trees, and terrain to remain unseen, to blend into the environment completely, and to strike only when he had total advantage. Over time, his training became almost instinctual. He could calculate distances in his mind, judge the trajectory of a shot in seconds, and vanish before anyone knew he had fired. Each success reinforced his reputation among those who secretly observed him, though outside the immediate circle. He was just another boy growing up under slavery, invisible and underestimated. By the time the Civil War broke out, he had combined his childhood lessons with formal marksmanship into a single, terrifying proficiency. He could shoot from long distances, hitting targets others wouldn't even attempt. He could hide in plain sight, waiting for patrols or soldiers to move into positions where they became vulnerable. His knowledge of both the land and the human mind allowed him to set traps, mislead pursuers, and strike quickly before disappearing into the forest. Word of a mysterious marksman began to spread among Confederate scouts and local slave hunters, though no one knew his identity. To them, he became the ghost sniper, a phantom who could kill without warning and vanish without trace. Even more remarkable was his ability to combine his natural intuition with tactical thinking. He knew when to fire, when to retreat, and when to simply observe. Every action was deliberate, every shot calculated. Unlike most soldiers or hunters, he did not rely on brute force or numbers. He relied on patience, cunning, and precision. He could turn ordinary terrain, a riverbank, a cluster of trees, or a small rise in the field, into an advantage that amplified his skills. To the untrained eye, it was magic. To him, it was practice, observation, and instinct refined by a lifetime of survival under impossible conditions. His reputation grew not just because of the accuracy of his shots, but because of the psychological effect he had on those who hunted him. Slave hunters who had once been confident, cocky, and brutal suddenly became cautious, paranoid, and afraid. Every patrol feared the unseen eyes of the ghost sniper watching them, calculating the perfect moment to strike. The boy's mastery of marksmanship had transcended mere shooting. It had become a form of psychological warfare, a way to control and terrorize his enemies without ever being caught. In the end, it was this combination of natural talent, refined skill, and strategic cunning that defined him. He was more than a marksman. He was a force of nature, shaped by a cruel world, but refusing to be broken by it. Every shot he fired, every step he took, was a reminder that survival under oppression could be transformed into a weapon, one that no hunter, no army, could easily defeat. This was the foundation of the ghost sniper's legend, a man who took the very skills designed to keep him alive and turned them into something that history would never forget. His first encounters with slave hunters and Confederate patrols were nothing short of legendary, though they began quietly, almost imperceptibly. He was still young, but already a master of patience and stealth, moving through forests, swamps, and fields with the ease of someone who belonged to the shadows. Word of a runaway slave with uncanny accuracy had not yet spread far, but the local overseers and hunters were already wary. They had heard rumors, whispers of a boy who could appear and disappear at will, who left no trace except for those he chose to strike. The first documented encounter occurred on a humid spring morning. The hunters had been tracking him for days, following a series of faint footprints through the dense undergrowth. They assumed he would be tired, perhaps desperate, and ready to surrender if confronted. But he had anticipated them. From his hiding place atop a low hill, he observed their movements carefully. The men moved in a predictable pattern, their dogs leading the way, confident in their numbers. To any other runaway, they would have seemed unstoppable. To him, they were merely pieces in a puzzle he had already solved. He waited silent and perfectly still, until the moment when one hunter stepped slightly apart from the group. Using a small rifle he had secretly acquired, he fired a single shot that struck the man in the shoulder. The others froze, their confidence shattered. Before they could react, he vanished, slipping through the trees, leaving the hunters bewildered and panicked. When they tried to regroup, they realized their dogs had gone berserk, barking and running in circles, as if sensing the boy's presence but unable to locate him. By the time the hunters recovered, he was gone. No tracks led out, no sign of his path, only the faint echo of the rifle shot and the knowledge that they had been outsmarted. This first encounter set the tone for everything that followed. The hunters learned quickly that this was no ordinary runaway. He didn't run blindly. He didn't fight without strategy. Every movement, every shot, every disappearance was calculated. He used the terrain to his advantage, forcing hunters into choke points, creating distractions, and disappearing before they could even process what had happened. His knowledge of the land, the swamps, the rivers, the hidden paths, allowed him to appear where he wasn't expected and vanish where no one could follow. It was as if he had eyes everywhere, predicting their moves long before they acted. In another encounter, a Confederate patrol believed they had cornered him near the edge of a forest. They set a trap, hoping to cut off every possible exit. The patrol surrounded a clearing, confident in their numbers, and called for him to surrender. From the treetops, he watched quietly. He allowed them to believe they had him trapped. Then, in a masterstroke of timing, he fired 2 shots in rapid succession, one hitting a rider's horse, causing it to bolt, and the second grazing the shoulder of a soldier who stepped forward too quickly. The patrol descended into chaos. Horses reared, men shouted, and dogs barked madly, and in the confusion he slipped silently away, leaving nothing behind but chaos and fear. The psychological impact of these encounters was as significant as the physical. Slave hunters and Confederate soldiers began to whisper about him in hushed tones, passing stories along to warn each other. They spoke of a ghost that could strike from nowhere, that left no footprints, and never seemed to tire. Entire patrols became hesitant, unsure of when to move, fearful that a single misstep could be their last. His reputation as the ghost sniper spread faster than any printed notice, carried by word of mouth and fear, growing into legend even before most people had ever seen him. These early encounters also honed his skills further. Each time he evaded capture or struck a target, he learned more about his adversaries. He observed their reactions to fear, to confusion, and to surprise. He understood that controlling the hunter's perception could be as powerful as any bullet. By manipulating panic and chaos, he ensured that he was always one step ahead. Even when faced with superior numbers, he could level the playing field with patience, precision, and an uncanny understanding of human behavior. By the end of his first year as a hunted man, he had become a figure that no hunter dared to underestimate. The ghost sniper was not just a skilled marksman, he was a master of stealth, psychology, and survival. Every encounter reinforced his reputation, making him a living nightmare for anyone tasked with capturing him. And while the world may have tried to reduce him to a story, the truth was clear to those who faced him. He was a force shaped by oppression, honed by necessity, and empowered by the knowledge that he would never be caught alive unless he allowed it. These encounters laid the foundation for the myth and the reality of the ghost sniper. They demonstrated that survival alone was not enough. He needed strategy, patience, and an intimate understanding of his enemies. He became the perfect combination of hunter and hunted, someone who could strike fear into the hearts of the most experienced pursuers, turning every encounter into a lesson in terror and precision. The ghost sniper's methods of ambush, stealth, and psychological warfare were unlike anything his pursuers had ever encountered, and they quickly became the stuff of nightmares. He didn't rely on brute force or large-scale confrontations. Instead, he turned patience, timing, and the landscape itself into weapons. Every action was deliberate, calculated, and designed to leave a lasting impression, not just physically, but mentally. To the hunters and Confederate patrols, it was as if they were being hunted by a force that existed outside the normal rules of the world. His approach to ambushes was methodical. He understood that the average hunter operated under predictable patterns, moving in patrols, relying on dogs, and expecting the hunted to flee in obvious directions. He used this against them, creating decoys and false trails to mislead them. A broken branch here, a shifted footprint there, or a faint echo of movement could convince even the most seasoned hunter that the ghost sniper had taken one path, while in reality, he was preparing to strike from another, entirely unexpected direction. By the time the hunters realized their error, he had already vanished into the shadows. Stealth was his greatest ally. He had mastered the art of moving without sound, blending seamlessly into forests, swamps, and fields. He could lie in wait for hours, sometimes even days, without shifting a muscle, watching his enemies with calm, calculated attention. Birds might perch nearby without being startled, leaves would fall without notice, and even the wind seemed to bend around him. This unnatural stillness unnerved the hunters, who often felt eyes upon them, even when no one was visible. His presence was a ghostly whisper, felt more than seen, and it allowed him to control the battlefield without ever revealing himself. The psychological warfare he employed was equally devastating. He understood fear in a way few men of the time did. He knew that panic could be as lethal as a bullet, and he often used it to his advantage. Hunters would hear the faint click of a trigger or the rustle of movement in the trees and feel their hearts pound as adrenaline surged. Then they might see a figure dart between shadows, only to disappear again. Sometimes he would fire a single shot into the distance, not to harm, but to unsettle them, making them question every step, every decision, and every movement. By exploiting their fear, he made them hesitate, doubt themselves, and ultimately make mistakes that allowed him to strike again or escape unscathed. He also understood the power of reputation. Every story he left behind, of a shot fired from nowhere, of a hunter disappearing into the swamp after a brief encounter, of a patrol so spooked they abandoned the chase, reinforced the terror he inspired. Word traveled quickly, and soon, even the most confident slave hunters approached the forests and fields with trepidation, wary of invisible eyes that might be watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment. His legend became a tool, a weapon that worked alongside his rifles and traps. Traps and environmental manipulation were a critical part of his strategy. He could topple a tree branch to block a path, scatter stones to mislead dogs, or lay debris to create the illusion of footprints leading in one direction while he moved in another. Waterways, marshes, and uneven terrain became extensions of his will, natural tools he wielded with deadly precision. Some reports describe hunters following him for hours, only to find themselves back at the same clearing they started from, their confidence eroded and their fear heightened. Every step he forced them to take was designed to confuse, exhaust, and intimidate. Perhaps most terrifying of all was his timing. He understood that a single shot at the right moment could change the entire scenario. He didn't fire recklessly. He waited until the hunter exposed themselves, until the angle was perfect, until there was no possibility of retaliation. Sometimes he would strike and retreat immediately. Other times he would remain hidden after a shot, letting the hunter discover that their companion had fallen, their morale shattered, and their nerves frayed. In each encounter, he turned patience into power, making fear a weapon that worked even when he didn't fire a single shot. The ghost sniper's mastery of these methods made him nearly untouchable. Pursuers began to suspect that he was not entirely human, a phantom that slipped through their fingers, appearing where he shouldn't and disappearing where he could not be found. The more hunters tried to capture him, the more clever he became, refining his techniques, learning their patterns, and exploiting weaknesses with surgical precision. It was a war fought not just with rifles, but with strategy, wits, and an uncanny understanding of human psychology. Every encounter left a mark, not only in terms of the physical casualties he inflicted, but in the terror he instilled. Confederate patrols reported sleepless nights, jumpy reactions, and paranoia. Hunters who once relied on dogs and numbers found themselves second, guessing every decision, haunted by the knowledge that a single miscalculation could bring death from an unseen hand. By combining ambush, stealth, and psychological warfare, the ghost sniper had transformed the simple act of survival into a lethal art form, one that history would never forget. In essence, his methods turned the natural world into an extension of his will, his enemies into unwitting players in a game they could never win, and his legend into a weapon just as potent as any rifle. The ghost sniper didn't just survive, he dominated, teaching a brutal lesson that courage alone could not match: cunning, patience, and an intimate understanding of both land and mind. The impact of the ghost sniper's actions went far beyond the immediate threats. He posed to slave hunters and Confederate patrols. While his marksmanship and ambush tactics were terrifying in their own right, it was the lasting psychological effect and the legend that grew around him that made him truly unforgettable. For the men who chased him, the experience left a permanent scar, a mixture of fear, respect, and disbelief. Entire patrols were broken not just physically, but mentally, by the realization that they were up against someone who could think, move, and strike in ways they had never anticipated. They had faced men in battle before, but no one had fought someone who seemed to anticipate every step, manipulate every movement, and vanish before retaliation was possible. News of the ghost sniper spread quickly through the southern states, carried by terrified hunters, soldiers, and local inhabitants who witnessed his uncanny abilities. Every retelling added details, some true, some exaggerated, but all contributed to a growing aura of fear. The story of a shadowy figure appearing and disappearing, striking without warning, and leaving no trace became the dominant narrative. Hunters who once boasted about their skills began whispering about a figure that defied the natural laws of pursuit, instilling fear not just in those who knew him, but also in anyone who traveled through the forests, swamps, and plantations he once roamed. His legend became a cautionary tale: underestimate him, and you wouldn't live to tell the story. The ghost sniper also inspired a subtle kind of rebellion among the enslaved population. He was a living symbol of resistance, a man who took what little power, was afforded to him by the oppressive system and turned it into something terrifying for his oppressors. His actions demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and mastery of one's environment could challenge even those armed with the law and weapons. Stories circulated of other enslaved people taking inspiration from his cunning and courage, learning to move stealthily, hide effectively, and strike when the moment was right. In this way, his legacy was not only about fear, but also about empowerment, a symbol of resistance in a time when power was systematically denied. Military and civilian leaders alike took notice. Reports of ambushes and inexplicable killings forced Confederate patrols to reconsider their strategies. Groups that had once hunted without fear now moved cautiously, double-checking paths and relying heavily on scouts. Some even abandoned territories entirely, unwilling to risk encountering the ghost sniper. In effect, he altered the balance of control in those regions. The mere rumor of his presence could halt movement, delay missions, and create an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that could be exploited by anyone familiar with the terrain. His influence extended beyond individual kills. He became a force that shaped behavior and strategy in the wider area. Even after the Civil War ended, the stories of the ghost sniper persisted. Hunters, former soldiers, and locals passed down tales of the figure who could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish without a trace. Some claimed to have seen him years later, moving silently through the woods, a ghostly reminder of a time when one man could turn fear itself into a weapon. These stories served multiple purposes. They were warnings, legends, and historical memory all at once. They reminded communities of the consequences of cruelty, the intelligence and cunning of the oppressed, and the power of someone who refused to be captured. The ghost sniper's legacy also became part of cultural memory, influencing folklore, oral histories, and even early literature about the Civil War and the struggle for freedom. While historians debated the exact details of his exploits, there was no denying the psychological imprint he left. His story illustrated that survival under extreme oppression could be transformed into mastery and dominance over those who sought to control him. It was not just the rifle that made him deadly. It was the combination of fear, cunning, and anticipation that made him untouchable. Perhaps the most enduring part of his legacy was the way he embodied both human resilience and the power of reputation. His enemies feared him not merely because he was skilled, but because they didn't understand him. The uncertainty, the unpredictability, and the aura of invincibility created a psychological landscape in which even the strongest hunters second-guessed every step. In this sense, the ghost sniper's greatest weapon was never his rifle. It was the legend he created in real time, the terror that preceded his presence, and the memory that lingered long after he disappeared from sight. Even today, his story resonates. It serves as a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of those oppressed, and a reminder that power is not always measured by guns or numbers, but by intelligence, patience, and the ability to manipulate perception. The ghost sniper changed the way hunters thought about pursuit, the way communities thought about resistance, and the way history remembers a man who could vanish as quickly as he could strike. He became more than a man. He became an idea that one determined individual could challenge an entire system, turning fear into a weapon that lasted long after the smoke cleared.